Hello and welcome to a special episode of In Conversation. Today, my guest is Marloes Bontje, and we will be celebrating her book, co-authored with Andy Harriman, Somewhere Leather and Somewhere Lace, which has just turned 10 years this month. Marloes, welcome and congratulations. I must say, this book is a staff favorite intellect and among many of our partners, and it remains one of our best sellers, of course, as well. We're so proud to be associated with the book, and I'm delighted to have you on the podcast today. So welcome, and just maybe begin by telling us sort of who you are and where you're calling in from.
Thank you, James. It's very nice to hear that the book is still so loved. That's the first thing I want to say. So yeah, my name is Marloes. It's a very Dutch name, and that's why I pronounce it now, so everyone knows how to pronounce it. I live in the Netherlands, but currently I live in Norway. So I'm at a school right now where I follow traditional handcrafts, pretty much as a sabbatical. So that's why I'm not calling from home today and from this place. And yeah, I'm happy to talk to you, James. I heard you had some questions for me, so let's start.
I sure do. Yeah, I can see hints of snow in the background there, which is interesting, and I'm sure many of our colleagues back in the UK have been familiar with some of that. But I'm myself at a conference in Tampa, so it's quite odd to see the snow behind you. But we're in very different locations, but it's nice that we both have the book in front of us. So yeah, I do have a few questions for you, but I thought it might be nice just to start by focusing on the book. Perhaps you could just, for anyone who's out there who doesn't necessarily know the book or hasn't had the opportunity to see a copy or read it, could you just describe it to us in sort of a nutshell? Tell us what it's about, and maybe also then we could go on to discuss what the key message in the book is. But yeah, what's this book all about?
Okay, so Somewhere Leather, Somewhere Lace is basically a documentation of the birth of the Goth scene. And if you know a little bit about Goth, or maybe not, but so it came from Postpunk, punk, New Romantics, and the early experimenting with synthesizers and electronic music, and that merged into a new genre. And we now know the Gothic or the Goth genre as, one of the most known subcultures or like subgenres in music and fashion. But back then it was very new, and we felt that the documentation of this special, would say, form of art was not complete. And the book is a very visual journey into this birth of this genre. So on purpose, because I believe that pictures and photos will tell a great deal of the story. And also we have accompanied these pictures with a lot of interviews with people from back in the day who actually lived this scene. And so it's also an oral history of this music and this art form. And together that makes the book Somewhere Leather, Somewhere Lace. And yeah, I would say it has been a great project and also the approach to do it very visually and with oral history. I think that combination makes it a pretty unique book.
Yeah, I think you're right there. I think it's beautifully put together as well. Like even like the choice of paper and things like that really reflects the tones and the shades, not really the colors of the Goth movement. I think the book really kind of showcases the imagery really well. It's interesting you mentioned some of those oral histories as well, because it's interesting when you're flipping through there, because there's lots of people from the subculture who are fairly anonymous, although they don't look it. They have these incredible kind of outfits on, and they embody incredible sort of Goth style. But then there's these other characters that I recognize from other books we've published as well. Like I remember seeing Ron Athey, the performance artist. I was flipping through once. I was like, hang on a minute, that's Ron Athey. So it's amazing to see who else has been kind of involved in this scene and where maybe their early forays in goth subcultures have then led them in their own art forms and things as well. So it's interesting as a jumping off point to see where many people started their careers in these different scenes. Can you remember anyone else from the book that kind of stands out to you? Are there any sort of images or any individuals that you remember particularly interviewing or that stand out as memorable to you?
I would say not very specific people, because I believe that a scene like that is not only built with like iconic people or like the famous people or the ones that were on stage. So for me, the mix of interviews between the people who are on stage and the people who are off stage, I think that, that combination of the type of people really worked. And I'm a little against writing about music and only covering the icons.
Mm.
You don't have a scene if you don't have an audience. So I think that was done on purpose in this book. But of course, there are a lot of remarkable figures in the goth scene. For instance, the singer of the Sisters of Mercy was quite an interesting figure. You've got Susie from Susie and the Banshees. You have Robert Smith from The Cure, Ian Curtis, Joy Division, and in the American goth scene there were a couple of interesting figures, and also in Germany and quite a lot of the other countries that were really involved in this art form. There's too many to name, but they've, their performances and their appearances and their music has lived on since then. So yeah, we were not able to interview all of these people. I think also because we didn't really want to focus on all these people. It needed to be about the normal people who normal, how can I say that? The regular club goers, club visitors, and yeah.
Just general members of the subculture. And yeah. I think that's a great answer. And I think the book really does embody that answer as well, which is really cool. Speaking about the images and sort of time frame, the images are, largely black and white. I know there's some color in there too, but can you sort of give us the period? When does the book sort of what's the time period of the book? When are the photos from and until?
So the photos are quite strictly just from the 80s.
Right.
And I know the roots of the scene are a little earlier than the 80s. So post-punk already started in the late 70s. And you see that the time frame of the goth scene also is not completely the same depending on what country or what region of the world you are. So for instance, in Eastern Europe, the time frame moves up a little bit later in the 80s. Mm. It also hits the early 90s. So it's a little tricky to just make a claim like we're just going to write about the 80s. If you know that historically it's a little more nuanced than that. But I think what's interesting is that you see the progress of the way that people looked throughout the 80s, and I think that's also visible in the book.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Is that the main? Is there any other reasons why you specifically chose the decade of the 1980s and sort of thought just because it's nice and neat, or was there a specific reason behind that decision?
I think that photography, like club photography, or maybe like photographing artists, or maybe amateur photographers that went out and about and photographed either themselves or friends, that was a little more common, I would say, in the 80s. And also, if you look at photos that are dating pre-80s, the quality is a little less.
Okay.
At least for a lot of amateur photography, I would say that the colors and the chemicals behind it kind of like stabilized a bit better. So that's why a lot of photos from the 50s, 60s, or 70s are kind of like turning out orange right now and like looking very old, whereas a lot of photos from later time frame are sometimes a little more stable and usable.
Right. You seem to know quite a bit about photography and images. Could you tell us a little bit about your kind of expertise and what sort of led you into this world and how you encountered all these images?
I'd say that my interest in photos of this time, and specifically from this subculture, or started as when I was a teenager, and I knew that like the dark scene, the goth scene has had so much history, and I felt kind of frustrated that there was so little visible still of this scene, or at least that was my experience back in the I would say between 2000 and 2010, that decade. So I knew what these people were looking like, but I didn't have the evidence. So since I studied history, I was very keen on finding the evidence of this particular part of history. And I started searching photos, first also by professional photographers, and also after some time learned that a lot of people had taken their photos when they were younger, and taking photos of friends and taking photos of the clubs they went to, or the artists they saw on stage. And they were putting them on Facebook or on their own websites. Or so more of this evidence came actually online, and some of the evidence was already printed, for instance, by someone like Nick Mercer, but also some other photographers or people who have been documenting their like childhood, or like the music scene of their youth. And what I really like about photos is that, like I told in the beginning, it kind of like tells a story by itself. You don't need much words. And even though a lot of photos are staged, they are not maybe the reality that you see, but they are still, especially when a photographer has thought about composition and color and, you know, light and all that stuff. It can be just really interesting to look at these photos and collecting them and comparing them. And especially with analog photos, because we're talking about analog photos here, it's a different experience than the digital photos I mostly grew up with. Especially after the year 2000, there was a lot of digital photography. And I learned to really love again the analog photos, and especially the ones from the 80s that have a very nice grain to the image.
Yeah.
And they have very warm colors. And even if they get a little bit decolorized, which some have some decolorization, which happens to a lot of photos that are, you know, aging, it kind of like the colors changes in a very nice way. And it gets a little warmer, a little colder, but it can be really pretty.
Yeah, I agree with that. And that's why I mentioned the paper stock earlier, because that grain that these images have and they embody, that kind of shows through, I think, with the choice of paper stock, and that's been really kind of amplified. So yeah, I think by having that uncoated paper in the book, it really kind of draws out that kind of granular nature, and again, the analog nature of the images you've chosen to use. They certainly don't look shiny, you know, and kind of mass market. They do look like artful photography, really quite beautiful images. Oh, that's really interesting. Well, thank you for sharing that with me. And again, with the book, you've mentioned a few places, but what are the main locations that you're interested in? Because I know there's like sort of like London, there's places in Eastern Europe, there's New York. I mean, what are the main focal points of the volume?
I would say that even though we try to make a worldwide documentation, I'd say we have not succeeded. And it's hard to cover the whole world. So I would say that the title might have been a little bold, but we've tried to not stick around in the UK, because the UK, no bad words about cultural developments of the UK and all the great music they've brought us, but I would say that the British have a tendency to also claim a lot of the music history, and that's
what? Us Brits? Oh, I don't know about that.
Yeah, so I think that it's kind of like maybe an easy to follow that path and to follow that, like, I'd say theory. And we have to look to other regions in Europe, or maybe even outside of Europe, that have contributed to musical development. And but I mean, yeah, historically, I have to admit, London and Leeds were like leading in the goth style. So that's completely true. I'm not gonna sort of like put that completely away. But I mean, if you look at, for instance, Germany doesn't really have like traditionally a pop culture. They have like Schlager music, and they have an interesting history in synthetic music, like electronic music.
Yeah.
And from that scene, they started to experiment with darker sounds. And so they've made a lot of contributions to a lot of the darker electronic music. And it's funny because, especially if you look at the last 10 years or so, they've completely sort of like draw the goth scene and the dark scene back to Germany again.
Yeah.
And if you now look at how the goth scene, how it has operated the last decade, it has been very much focused on Germany, especially in Berlin. And there was so much, I remember in the scene, there were so many people complaining, oh, Berlin has so many parties and so many festivals already. It's unfair. We want to have them, in our cities as well. So it's interesting how like the metropole of like the heart of the scene can sort of like move around and or has its completely own culture. For instance, in the Latin American goth scene is very big also. They have their own, I would say, what's the word for that? Their own planet almost, like
right.
It's like their own thing. And but in the 80s, it's interesting how the goth style has spread out and what countries were at start not involved yet. But there were also early adopters. And for instance, Japan was really early on. They were part of it. And of course, a lot of European countries were already quite soon part of the aesthetic and the type of music.
I wanted to ask you what actually kind of first drew you to this goth style and subculture. Can you remember?
Let's see. I think, well, I mean, around the early 2000s, I would say the goth scene has, it was still really strong at that time. And I almost wanted to say, okay, it made a comeback, but that's not really true because it was already there. But the comeback in the mainstream, that was something that was happening in the early 2000s. And that's how I got to know the goth style and the goth music. Even though the artists that were then labeled as gothic or like goth, they were not very happy with that label at all. But I mean, I don't think there was ever any band in the history that wanted to be labeled goth. So that's like also a tradition by now. So bands like Evanescence, for instance, or the Rasmus, or actually it were like rock bands that supported the goth look or maybe like a dark aesthetic.
Yeah, I guess even some of the new metal as well, even that was coming out of the US, in particular, probably had quite a lot of goth influence on the style. Like, I guess the sort of likes of Papa Roach and Linkin Park and things like that probably took that to a more of an American audience, a younger American audience again.
Yeah. And so the funny thing is, when these bands were confronted by their so-called, goth label in interviews, they always denied it and they said, goth, we're not goth. I would say that The Cure is goth, or the Sisters of Mercy are goth.
Yeah.
And then I learned through that answer about these bands, and then I find out, those are the original, the real goth bands.
Yeah.
And that's how I learned, actually.
What about does this goth sort of subculture and style, does it have like a real DIY element to it, a bit like sort of punk, or is that fair to say? Is it important that people, I can imagine with the elaborate makeup, you almost have to be a makeup artist to be able to pull off some of the makeup we see from the book, let's say, and some of the hairstyles and some of the elaborate sort of almost, costumes would be the wrong word, but the style that people embody. I imagine there's a lot of work goes into that. So would you say it's kind of a DIY scene, almost like connected with craft almost, and that kind of like making culture?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's one of the key elements of this scene. I don't think I have met goths, or well, they never call themselves like that, but
Yeah.
people who support goth music and goth style, who are not creative with their outfit.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's people who are not maybe into making clothing, but they find it more interesting to do their hair or their makeup or do other crafts. But they always have something they do by themselves, or maybe just make a patch on their leather jacket or something like that. And I think it's also a way to sort of like, yeah, it's an expression, but it's also a nice way, it's a social way to get to talk to each other, because when you're on a party and you see someone who looks really, really cool or has a really nice patch, you have a way in to sort of like connect with each other.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Yeah, no, I think that's kind of really interesting. It's like an icebreaker, isn't it, as well?
Yeah, I mean, especially because I wouldn't say goth people are shy, but they're a lot. I would say there are quite a few introverted people. But if you sort of like, they know we have a common interest and we have an excuse to talk to each other, they can be very social.
Yeah, no, I wonder if the likes of sort of Chapel Rowan and some of the contemporary pop singers, who embody that sort of drag and slightly goth kind of aesthetic, I wonder if they're going to create a new resurgence among a young generation, which also leads me on to think about some of the iconic designers and individuals who have been involved in the scene. Would you say there's any sort of famous or particularly impactful, designers or makers that have been involved in the subculture or the scene? Is there anyone, a bit like sort of Vivienne Westwood, I guess, is on the edge, but more associated with punk? Is there anyone like that you would highlight who's been instrumental in developing the style or the images and the way that people look?
That's a good question. I think that I haven't run into someone yet coming from the scene that doesn't like Alexander McQueen, for instance.
Yeah,
because he has a very beautiful, dark, fairy tale, romantic aesthetic, at least in a lot of his clothing or his fashion. So that's definitely a very well appreciated.
No, that makes sense, and I guess his dark story as well kind of does probably kind of add a little bit of emphasis to it as well.
Yeah, it's definitely tragic what happened to him, and maybe that also helps. But I would say that in terms of fashion, I think the goth scene has always looked back. So they are very much inspired, maybe not so by individual designers, but like historical fashion.
Yeah,
especially the Victorian era. But also the 1920s, I would say, is very important.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. In what sense though? Do you mean sort of like what the sort of flappers and things like that, or do you mean what
I would say more the like the glamorous nightlife type of outfits, and the cabaret and the that's very extravagant type of dressing. That's very influential, and if you look at the goth scene now, they are very much grabbing the like, what's the word for that? Like falling back on the 80s, actually.
Yeah,
is something that has been going on for some years now. That like the trad goth, the traditional goth look, has been completely what's the word, appropriated even, or like recycled.
Yeah.
And I think that might, like, historical fashion might be even more important than specific designers.
Yeah. Okay. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think we'd be remiss not to talk a little bit about music though as well, and how influential that has been on the goth style and goth scene. And of course, you've mentioned some of the most notable figures, especially out of the UK scene, like Susie Sue, of course, who I sort of grew up with, and that's certainly one of my icons from this scene. But music's obviously had a big influence on the scene, but has music had a big influence on you and your work? Are there any musicians or bands that sort of you revere or that you take inspiration from?
I would say I'm a very long time fan of The Cure.
Okay. Yeah.
Which is almost a boring answer because I know that nearly a lot of people love that band. So it's
hard to ignore Robert Smith and The Cure, though, isn't it? Both in terms of the amazing music that they've produced over their long storied career, including a new album fairly recently, right? But then also, just in terms of if you're going to pick someone who's iconic from that scene, I think Robert Smith has to be pretty high on the list, doesn't he? Really?
Yeah. Okay. Exactly.
What about someone from further afield though, maybe? Because you'd mentioned Europe and how that we always, we Brits like to take a little bit too much, maybe put a little bit too much on ourselves. But is there anyone from Europe you'd highlight?
I find it's a difficult question because I don't think I really think in like bands or artists, but often more like in songs or like a very specific style that I like to listen to. And I'm hardly like really completely into one band, maybe except for The Cure, which was a pretty deep love, I would say.
And well, what about, other than Robert Smith and The Cure, do you have any sort of personal style icons from the scene? We've mentioned designers and things like that, but are there any kind of, there's quite a few individuals in the book and it's difficult to pick them out, but are there any kind of iconic people? If someone was like, other than Robert Smith, who's an icon from the scene that you would point someone to, an alien visiting Earth for the first time who wanted to find out all about goth, who would you kind of be like, there's a goth?
I would say Patricia Morrison.
Okay.
Yeah, she looks so glamorous and elegant, and she was actually supporting a goth look with quite a long hair, and a lot of goths have pretty short hair, like mullets and stuff. Long hair was, I think, more associated with like heavy metal, but she kind of like pulled it off and looked like like a witch in a very like stylish way, which was she had a great look. So that was definitely a person I had as a fashion icon when I was younger. Yeah.
Well, I just want to go back to the book more specifically for a second. I wanted to ask you briefly about your collaboration with your sort of co-author Andy Harriman, and maybe you could just tell us a little bit about the origin story of the book and how you two, what your vision was and how you brought that to reality.
Yeah, for sure. So now we go back to the year, I think 2009 or 2010. And as I told before, I was collecting a lot of photos from back in the day, how people were looking punk, post-punk, new wave, new romantic, goth. And I figured that I wanted to collect the photos on a Tumblr to make like a photo collage, basically. And I noticed that there were quite some people who were into this style and into this music on Tumblr and on internet anyway. I didn't expect that, so I got quite some followers, and with some of them I had nice interaction as well. And I think somewhere in 2012, Andy she was following my blog, and she wrote me a message that she enjoyed the blog and that she was also quite into this music, and she was considering writing about this genre. And at that time, a lot of other people have been saying to me, oh, you should write a book about, or you should make a book about these nice photos. And at that time I say, okay, maybe not, because I'm still in university and I don't have enough time for that. But when Andy came around, we started like talking about this idea and sharing thoughts. And we suddenly saw an opportunity to maybe just do it together, because you can divide the work, and we had a similar vision of how it should look like and what angle it needed to have. And we already had this network or like photos and names of people we could approach. So we had like a base material because of the blog I was doing. So it was a very good starting point to start building on top of the research that I sort of like already did in my free time. And there we started to contact people for interviews, and we divided the work in who's doing what interview, and we collected even more photos, because we didn't want to put all the photos that were already online into a book. We wanted to come with new material.
I think that's important to say, actually, because it is another reason why it's a wonderful book, is there's a lot of tremendous imagery that is elsewhere unseen, right?
Yeah, and but it's important to also do that, find that new material, because now we're publishing in a print form. You will need to ask permission or need to pay for professional photography. Mm-hmm. So this was a step in the research that was just very important to take. But because we had to do that, we could also tap into the archives of some of these photographers, or like some of individuals who could ask them, oh, do you even have more photos? Can we look at it? And maybe we can add them to the selection. And that through that system, we were able to kind of like find a lot of cool footage from back in the day.
And the book has sold well, and that wasn't a big surprise for us, but we weren't expecting it to do quite as well as it has. Were you expecting to reach a mainstream audience? And admittedly, it's quite a specialist book, and it will have certainly had a resonance among the goth community for sure, and of course among fashionistas, fashion designers, the broader fashion studies community. But this is really a book that can sit there on among the special collections in Waterstones or Barnes and Noble, etc. And is there something about the book that you think translates it into that mainstream, or that's made it successful for such a wide range of people?
I must say that I'm not aware that it has hit mainstream. I would say it's still in the niche, but it's so in the niche of people who are like into fashion or into subcultures or into goth. So I'm not aware that like mainstream, I'm not sure how to even consider this mainstream group. I always thought that the people who were buying that book already had a very special interest in that. But maybe there's more people that I haven't thought about that also consult the book or read the book or take some inspiration. Yeah.
I mean, I think, working in sales and marketing, I think I can say that the book does definitely have more of a mainstream appeal, and has had more success among what I would call a mainstream reader than perhaps that you're aware of or letting on to. So no, I think you should accept your flowers in that sense. It's definitely like worth congratulations, because it's very difficult to take something like this that is very focused and specialist, and for that to have a life beyond that group and beyond the scholarly community and the practice-led community that a lot of these books service. So no, the numbers don't lie. It definitely has bled into a more mainstream reader. Of course, selling it at conferences, events, and selling it through bookshops, I know that it definitely has had a life beyond just those people perhaps that we initially expected to have interest in it, which is always a bit of a surprise, but always wonderful when you're dealing with the kinds of books that we publish.
Yeah, but to go back to your earlier question about how to explain maybe the success, I remember that when we released the book or published the book in 2014, there was a revival going on. So we were like just in time to catch with this revival, which was building up at that point. So I already saw that the scene was very much leaning towards the 1980s and towards the traditional look. So we were kind of like lucky to tap into that need that people had, and for the need for looking into, you know, how it was done back in the old days, back in subculture times without internet. And so I think the timing was really good. But what surprised me actually was later in the 2010s, in that decade, I thought, okay, that will fizzle out at some point. That will be like, you know, the way revival scenes always go. They 5 years and they die down a bit. And the goth scene has its ups and downs, its dynamics. But then Gen Z has joined the club.
Yeah, of course, right.
And then I noticed that the book found another new crowd of very young people who are into this traditional goth look, or discovering post-punk music, maybe through their music collection of their parents, or maybe just through Spotify playlist, or wherever they find it, or their influencers or YouTubers they like, algorithms, whatever. Anyway, they got into the circle of this specific book and the scene. And I think if you look at the sales numbers of the book, you kind of see that the last 3 years were actually better maybe than the first 3 years.
Yeah. That is true. Yeah, I think the book has certainly had many lives, and the fact that the sales still continue, I think it's going to keep going, which is fantastic. And the book, it feels timeless. It looks timeless, and because it's embodies this period of the 80s, it will remain so, I think. And of course, the 80s, for us who were born and raised in that decade, we didn't necessarily get to experience it firsthand. I was born in 1983. But like at the same time, it's such a resonant decade, both in fashion, in culture, and music. And I think it was maligned perhaps in the 90s and in the early 2000s. And of course, now people are looking back like, oh man, that was such a cool decade. The music was amazing. The style was incredible. People were in these subcultures, whether it was hip hop, punk, or of course, goth, and it just, I think it's kind of, it's so you're kind of, by focusing on that decade, even though it wasn't necessarily for this particular reason, I think that is definitely a reason for the book's continued impact and success, because that decade in itself is now, rather than being maligned and relegated, is now sort of celebrated as this incredible decade. And it's had obviously its resurgence. I mean, like the 90s had their resurgence, in the 70s through the 90s into the 2000s, the way that it's kind of these subsequent generations kind of interplay and take elements, and how I guess the 70s were replicated in the 90s, and now we're seeing that again. It won't be long before the 80s comes back again, I wouldn't have thought, and we'll have another chance to kind of showcase this book to a different audience. Before I let you go, I wanted to ask you a couple of sort of like QuickTime questions, just a few silly things really, but I'm always keen to get people's answers to these. So I'm going to start with a kind of a fun one that I often ask people, and you're basically hosting a dinner party, okay? And you're allowed, maybe let's say, a guest list of 5 people, and they can be anybody, dead or alive. Who is making the cut? Who's on the guest list at your dinner party?
Oh, that's hard. I would say it maybe not even like known or famous people, but maybe like people from like historical decades that we don't know much about, and then they invite them just to hear them out on how life was back then. I would, as a historian, I would be very interested in doing that. But as for more known and famous people, maybe the writer Tolkien. That would be a very interesting guy to talk to. Yeah, I think generally a table with writers would be, I think, quite take my interest. That would be, a nice dinner, I think.
I love that. That's a great answer. And I think that represents kind of the ethos of the book as well. So that's a really cool answer. And I think Tolkien, I mean, you could spend hours just talking about his translation of Beowulf if you wanted to fully nerd out. But yeah, I mean, wow, just a man who's invented all those different languages and such a, you know, such an impactful set of stories and characters, an entire world like that could probably hold court, I reckon, and would be a great person to have at dinner party. That's a great answer. Speaking of books and writers, though, I was wondering, what are you currently reading? Anything on the shelves? Have you read anything either theoretical or fiction that's, you know, kind of taken, you know, really impacted you recently?
I'm reading Stefan Zweig.
Okay.
I think, I'm not sure what the title is in English, but The World of Yesterday.
Okay.
Maybe.
I'm not sure.
I'm reading it in Dutch, and I know the title in German, but I don't know the translation. But yeah, it's actually the last book he wrote, I think. It's like autobiography about the decades he lived through up until the Second World War. And it gives a very nice look into life in Central Europe in the late 19th century and the first 50 years of the 20th century.
Very cool. Well, thanks for sharing that with us. I also wanted to ask you, you know, you're obviously a person who has lived and traveled in several places and has also been aware of different cities and cultures through the archival work that you've done and through the photography curation. But do you have any favorite cities? Are there any cities that you love to visit, you know, for any reason?
Maybe I should stay on the page of Central Europe because I really love Central Europe. So I would say Budapest is great and Vienna is great. But I'm very much into visiting all European countries. I still haven't visited all of them, but I think they all have their charms. So, and currently I'm in a Nordic country, so even their cities, they can be very charming. So it's hard to pick, I would say. Yeah.
That's cool though. No, I appreciate that answer. And I wanted to ask you as well, what are you currently working on, or what's on the horizon for you?
I'm currently with sabbatical. So I'm learning traditional handicrafts and especially focused on folk art from the Nordic countries. I do this at a school close to Trondheim in Norway. And I choose this because I feel that I think it's a nice way to sort of like channel creativity, to really focus on new skills and also go to another place to sort of like immerse yourself into this. And I'm having a very good time here, so good choice to come here. What I secretly hope, though, is that it also taps into creativity to start writing again. I have ideas, but it's just on the level of ideas. As well as nonfiction as fiction, but it's also a bit tricky to talk about future writings because, you know, every other month people will sort of like keep asking like, oh, how's that novel of you going, or you know, you're going to start that project. So I'm a little careful with dropping that. But yeah, I really hope that in the future, near future, I will give some, put some serious effort into getting back on that track. Yeah.
Well, look, I want to say thank you very much for your time today, and I really appreciate you joining me, and I'm glad we were able to make this happen. I also want to say, you know, congratulations to you and Andy for the book. It's been wonderful speaking to you today and looking back at Somewhere Leather, Somewhere Lace at 10. I was around first time round. I worked on the marketing for the original campaign, and it's been an absolute pleasure to be here talking to you again today and thinking about how we can promote and build on the success of the book and take it to a new audience. Because like I said earlier, the book is timeless. The images are fantastic. The interviews are vitally important. And the work that you and Andy achieved there has been, is monumental. And it's one of my favorite books that we ever published, and I know many of my colleagues and co-authors and other people like that who are associated with the internet community love this volume. So it's a really, really, really happy day for me to be able to celebrate this one with you. So Marloes, thank you so much for your time. Do you have any final thoughts or anything you'd like to say?
Yeah, let's see. I've noticed that since the book came out, there has been more publications about this topic, which I really like, because it means that people value it a lot, to document subcultures and to interview these people before they pass away or before, you know, anything happens. And it's written by people who weren't there and people who were there. So I think both perspectives approaches are very great, and I really hope that people will keep adding to this like 80s goth library that's now sort of like coming into existence.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to find out about new editions, and I want to encourage people to keep reading and keep writing. And I also want to thank you, James, for co-promoting this book. It has been quite a journey since the start of the research, signing a book contract, publishing, and promoting this book. And it has been interesting how this book, every year, it sort of like comes back into my life, or I end up talking about this book with other people or promoting it somewhere else, or, you know. So it's nice that it has a long life, and I hope it will have another decade again.
I mean, undoubtedly, and we'll certainly be trying to ensure that it does. But for now, thank you again. I really appreciate all your time. A big congratulations. And I'd just like to say to anyone who's listening, if you're interested in finding out more about Somewhere Leather, Somewhere Lace, then you can go to www.intellectbooks.com, or you can visit the University of Chicago Press. And on either of those websites, you'll be able to buy a copy of the book at a very, very reasonable price as well. So do check it out. There's also a lot of promotion, a lot of materials, images, archival bits and pieces that we're putting out there into the world at the moment to celebrate this publication as well. So do keep an eye on our social media, and again, do look at that page, Somewhere Leather, Somewhere Lace, on the intellectbooks.com website, and you'll find loads more resources and other interesting bits and pieces about this book. Marloes, thank you again. It's been my pleasure to have you on In Conversation, and I'll see you all next time.